Hi there, and thanks very much for tuning in to the Explaining History YouTube channel. Now, in my last video, I was talking briefly about not getting too carried away with thinking about Hitler's private life, these lurid tales of him and Ava Braun and all this kind of stuff. It's not that big a deal. But there is an aspect to Hitler's private world that is important and is worth thinking about. And it was the informality of Hitler's style of government. So, the way to think about it is this, is that a modern democratic leader, not obviously the most recent one to be sworn in, but a modern democratic leader in most first world countries these days will have a wake up at about 5 a.m. where they'll be handed a bunch of dispatch boxes or a mountain of papers by somebody who's trained to sift through what's important and tell the Prime Minister or the President what they need to know. And their day will start there, and it'll probably end at about 11 o'clock at night after dozens of meetings that are normally about 10 or 15 minutes each, with the Prime Minister having to make fairly quick decisions on what's important. So it's hard work, sounds like a job from hell. Hitler's life wasn't like this. For the most part, Hitler didn't go to Berlin. He didn't like it. He saw Berlin as a kind of an antithesis to everything he believed. He believed that the soul of Germany was in places like Bavaria. So he spent the majority of his time at Berchtesgaden at his own personal retreat, the Berghof. And that was where kind of government decision making at least, not the bureaucratic kind of government, but decision making tended to happen mainly there. If you wanted, as a German Nazi minister, to visit Hitler, that's where you went, and it was difficult to actually get to the Berghof. In fact, certain Nazi ministers, people like Robert Ley, for example, would have their own representatives essentially garrisoned in the town of Berchtesgaden, and they would be, if they were lucky, invited up the hill to the mountaintop to have lunch with Hitler. So getting access to Hitler was difficult. This is the first kind of part of what I'm getting at this morning. And once you had access to Hitler, Hitler's routine was very unconventional. He would get up late, sometimes as late as 11 or 12, have lunch, go for long walks. There might be a bit of time in the day to look at some paperwork, but Hitler by and large didn't like looking at paperwork and didn't feel he should be looking at paperwork. He didn't feel it was part of his role. What he believed was that he was there as the kind of this spiritual and emotional representative of the will of the German people. He was there to inspire and not to get bogged down in bureaucracy. Stalin obviously was completely different, and Stalin's signature is over all sorts of different kinds of paperwork, from industrial plans through to literary criticism through to lists of people to have executed in the later 1930s. So Stalin is an arch bureaucrat. Hitler isn't at all. Hitler is interested in only a couple of, interested directly, shall we say, in only a couple of policy areas. Foreign policy, where his ego appealed to him. He saw himself as this great statesman striding across Europe, making deals and declaring wars. And art and culture, where he thought he was the arbiter of taste, the arbiter of German culture, and only he could really understand what a German culture really was or should be, or what German people should or should not be listening to or watching or hearing. So Hitler would become involved in the areas that he found important, and much of the time, when he was presented with things he wasn't interested in, he would shoo them away. Hitler's adjutant, his essential political butler, Hans Heinrich Lammers, was the gatekeeper between the rest of the world and the Führer. So, for example, if a minister who wasn't in favour wanted to access Hitler, they'd have to go to Lammers first. Lammers would say, well, what do you want? The minister would then explain the policy. Lammers would probably not even give it in paper form to Hitler, but might give a sort of a rough version of what the minister was saying. Hitler would then sometimes reply with a shrug or a grunt or some expression of disinterest. And Lammers would then have to translate that and take it back to the minister and say, well, yeah, I think the Fuhrer seems to either not like that or like it or what have you. So there was a great leeway for Nazi ministers to run with policy or assume it was what Hitler wanted, or simply just fabricate and say this comes with the will of the Fuhrer. And this is because of this informal style of government. This is how policy becomes one of the ways that policy becomes radicalized. And the other thing that's important for us when we're thinking about Hitler's own personal, the blurring really of Hitler's personal life and his work life, is that decision making was done informally. What that means is that Hitler would go for long walks after lunch, often round the mountainside from the Berghof, and very often he would, instead of having formal meetings about things, not that he didn't have formal meetings, but mainly decision making was done informally, he would say to someone like Himmler, well, you walk ahead with me and we will talk about important things. And much of what was discussed was off the record. Hitler rarely signed anything at all. Didn't like the idea of a paper trail, didn't like the idea of being held to account. And so for historians, we've got a huge problem, particularly when it comes to the Holocaust, of Hitler's paper trail. The fact that so many documents were burnt at the end of the war probably adds to this as well. So the informality that I was talking about yesterday, that is, it's important to really take that with a pinch of salt. But the informality that seeps into his government is a really essential part of understanding the workings and the dynamics of Nazism. Anyway, I hope that's useful, and tune in at 4 p.m. to the Explaining History Facebook page, where I'll be live streaming about everyday life in Stalin's Russia. Thanks very much.